Untangling Genesis, the J, the E and the P source. The Torah, corresponding to the first 5 books of the Bible, is a document of immense importance, and not just for the Jews, but also for the West. Dating these books, however, has been a hard puzzle, as they contain very few references to historical figures and events of known date. Yet, in the 19th century, a number of scholars managed to find a number of clues in the text to unravel a large part of the mystery. Based on the evolution of Hebrew over time, they identified various authors of the Bible, among them the J source, the E source and the P source. These different authors often tell the same stories in the Bible, with many similarities, but also with blatant contradictions. Examples include the story of creation, which is told twice in the Bible, and in a very different way, and Noah's flood, which consists of 2 interlaced stories, which each form a complete but different version of the tale. Something similar applies to the story of Moses on Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb as it is called by the other author, or the story of the miracles of Moses' staff, or Aaron's staff in the other version. And in each case there are interesting reasons as to why these changes were made. So we have a lot to talk about. Let's start. Hey, good to see you. This is Stephan, author of In Search of the Sublime. On this World History channel, we'll trace humanity's relentless pursuit of scientific truth, moral excellence and enlightenment. We'll meet anyone from Mesopotamian astronomers and Indian yogis to Greek philosophers and Enlightenment scientists. And you'll meet them firsthand using primary sources, giving you valuable insights that transcend the surface-level understanding you get on other channels. Go check it out for yourself. Let's start. To figure out when the various parts of the Bible were written, linguists have studied the evolution of the Hebrew language. Very roughly, the Hebrew of the Bible can be categorized into Archaic Hebrew from the 11th and 10th centuries BC, Classical Hebrew from the 9th to the 6th centuries BC, and then Late Hebrew from 5th century BC and later. Genesis, the first book of the Bible, contains Hebrew from all 3 of these periods, but it mostly stems from the Classical period. Only one part of Genesis, called the Blessing of Jacob, was originally written in Archaic Hebrew, although later on it was edited somewhat by other authors. But this is likely the oldest part of Genesis. According to the so-called documentary hypothesis, which I shorten as DH, and which was developed in the 19th century, the classic Hebrew in Genesis can be further subdivided into 3 sources, known as the Yahwist or J source, the Elohist or A source, and the later priestly or P source. In recent decades, various alternatives to the documentary hypothesis have been proposed, yet many weighty scholars still adhere to the original. And also the alternatives, even if they speak very critically of DH, often also recognize at least the P source and also the D source for the book of Deuteronomy, which we will not mention in this lecture, perhaps in a later one. So they also chop up the Bible into various different authors. The differences are just in the details. Now, let's look at the evidence. When reading the Bible for yourself, you will quickly be confused by a large number of doublet stories, which are roughly similar but also include stark contradictions. To name an example, there are 2 accounts of Moses hitting a large rock with his staff to obtain water. In one case, water comes out without problem, while in the other case, Moses is asked by God to speak to the rock, but instead he hits it with his staff, after which God is so offended that he does not let Moses enter the promised land. The 2 greatest examples of doublets are the 2 creation stories given in Genesis 1 and in Genesis 2. And there is also the story of Noah's flood in Genesis 6 to 8, which is also given twice, but here the stories are cut up and then interlaced, forming a somewhat coherent story, although with various doublets and contradictions. And if these stories are read apart, we get 2 complete versions of the story, each with its own typical vocabulary and also with its theological emphasis. And these 2 examples, creation and Noah, we will study in detail in the next lecture. Besides being doublets, these stories are also linguistically different. For instance, P uses completely different words and phrases than J and E, and therefore can be easily distinguished from J and E. And J and E, by the way, generally do have the same style, signaling that they must be based on each other or on a common source. But there is, however, one big difference used to distinguish J and E. For J consistently uses the word Yahweh for God, while E consistently uses the word Elohim for God. That is, until Moses reveals himself as Yahweh to Moses. And this, by the way, is why these sources are called A and G, A for Elohim and J for Yahweh. Let's start with J and E. According to the documentary hypotheses, J and E were written down after the Kingdom of Israel split into the Northern Kingdom of Israel and the Southern Kingdom of Judah. Although some of the stories in J or E might be older, but clues from the text show they were written down in this era. And E likely developed in Israel, while J came from Judah. And this became clear because both stories tend to focus on the interests of their own country. Let's name some examples. For instance, J claims that Abraham lived in Hebron for a while, which is a Judean city. While in E we read that Jacob struggles with God at Peniel, a city in Israel. And in the descriptions of Jacob's sons, who would become the ancestors of the tribes of Israel, E refers to the tribes that will become part of Israel, while J mentions Judah. And J even gives the birthright to Judah, as his 3 elder brothers, who would not form long-lasting tribes, were disqualified due to their bad deeds. And in E we read that Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, also receive a full portion of the inheritance of Jacob. And Jacob then adds that he believed Ephraim would become the greatest son. And he in fact became the ancestor of the tribe that came to rule Israel. Also in J, Joseph is saved by Judah, while in E he is saved by Reuben. And E speaks of the burial of Joseph, which is located in Israel. While in J the ark is an important part of the story, which was later housed in the temple in Jerusalem, while in contrast the ark is never mentioned in E. And finally, the priesthood of Judah claimed to be descendants of Aaron, Moses' brother, while the priesthood in Israel was linked to other Levites. And we also see this reflected in the sources. In E, Aaron is denigrated by having him make a golden calf and to convince the people to venerate it as God, which is a story that does not occur in J. Both these sources were finally combined after Israel was defeated by the Assyrians in 722 BC. Refugees from the north likely ended up in Judah, bringing E with them. And then the texts were combined into a text known as GE, which was then revised from a Judean perspective. Now to the P source. The P source is much easier to spot. As the name suggests, it was written by priests, the Aaronite priests of Jerusalem to be precise, and this clearly shows. For one, there is an enormous emphasis on laws and rituals, as you would expect from the priesthood. As you will explain later, P places the origins of the important rituals of Judaism in the era before the monarchy, before King David. And P also gives Aaron a much greater role, for they in fact were the Aaronite priests. For instance, P makes explicit that Aaron and not Moses was the firstborn son. And also, where J says, "And Yahweh said unto Moses," P turns this into "unto Moses and unto Aaron." And in GE, it was the staff of Moses with which miracles were performed, as can be written in Exodus 4, while in P it became Aaron's staff in Exodus 7, which likely confuse you if you ever read the text. Suddenly it's talking about Aaron's staff instead of Moses's. But most importantly in P, Aaron is also the first to perform a sacrifice, after he is consecrated as the first high priest. And this is remarkable as GE mentions earlier sacrifices by Cain and Abel, by Noah, by Abraham, by Isaac, by Jacob, and many others. And among these, the most famous one, of course, is the almost sacrifice by Abraham of his son Isaac, who was then later replaced by a ram. All of these stories are not mentioned by P. And this change was likely part of a project by the Aaronite priest to centralize religion around them. In their view, only the descendants of Aaron could perform sacrifices that were valid, making them the only mediators between humanity and the divine, which would also give them a lot more power, both over the monarchy and the people. Two stories about the rebellion in the wilderness during the Exodus also make this point. In GE, the characters Dathan and Abiram from the tribe of Reuben challenge Moses, claiming they better return to Egypt. But Moses then gets vindicated when God sends an earthquake that swallows the two men. In P, in contrast, the Levites rebel, this time led by a man named Korah. In this version, they challenge not Moses but Aaron, claiming that he can proclaim priesthood for himself. Moses then proposes a test, telling them to burn incense, but when they do, they are killed by God's fire. And in this case, just like with the story of Noah, both versions of the story are cut up and then interlaced to form one story. But with the different characters in both stories and the different motivations behind them, it is a very confusing read. But by looking at the two authors, it suddenly becomes clear. P also skips stories in which characters are visited by angels or experience visionary dreams, as these would also give people other than the Aaronite priests access to the divine. And this might also explain why P skipped the story of Joseph entirely, as it involved 6 dreams. And P also skips the story of the angels visiting Sodom and Gomorrah, and also the story of Jacob wrestling with God. And even the word prophet is only mentioned once in P, and in that case referring to Aaron. Now let's take a look at these sources in the Bible. On Wikipedia we can find a version of Genesis that presents the different sources in different colors. Let's take a look. Here we see Genesis with the priestly source in yellow, the Yahweh source in blue, and the Elohist source in a type of green. The first chapter, as you can see, was written by the P source, given in yellow, and it gives the first account of creation. While a few sentences into chapter 2 we get to the second creation story, which was written by J. Now let's move to chapter 6. Here we have the story of Noah. And as you can see, here the sources are intertwined. We see both sentences by P and by J. Only much later, in chapter 20, the E source comes in. And as you can see, here we even have a mixture of J, P, and E. After having discovered these sources, it became the next challenge to date them, which was very hard since the Torah contains very few references to historical figures or events of known date. Yet, there are a handful of clues, which we'll now discuss. For instance, J names Babylon the great world city, and it calls Kala or Nimrod the great city of the Assyrian Empire. And this narrows this source down to the 9th or 8th centuries, when both of these cities could be described as such. Also, J refers to the dispersion of the tribes Simeon and Levi, but not yet to the dispersion of the other tribes of Israel in 722 BC. So it's likely written between those two events. And J also mentions Edom's independence, a country underneath Judah. And this occurred during the reign of Jehoram, which started around 848 BC. So J was likely written between 848 BC and 722 BC. The dating of the E source is a little less precise. It also seems to have been written in the 9th or 8th centuries BC, given that it mentions conflicts between Israel and Aram. And again, it had to be written before 722 BC, before the fall of Israel. Now the P source. Here the Mesopotamian city Ur is called Ur of the Chaldeans, but the Chaldeans only gained political power in the 7th and 6th centuries BC. Most scholars believe P was written in the 6th century BC, after the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed and the Jews were deported to Babylon. This would explain, for example, why P makes no mention of the temple, as it was destroyed at the time, and it might also explain why P places the origin of Jewish rituals before the monarchy, since the monarchy no longer existed. But other scholars note that both Jeremiah and Ezekiel actually quote from P, while Ezekiel was deported to Babylon and Jeremiah fled to Egypt. And if they both had this source, it must have existed before the deportation. And there we have it, the evidence behind the J, the E and the P source. In the next lecture we'll study the two greatest stories that reflect the differences between J and P, namely the two creation stories and the two accounts of Noah's flood. Based on these stories, we see God transform from a tribal God who walked among men and spoke to men face to face, with a more distant and abstract God who spoke authoritatively from heaven. But for now, thanks for watching. I hope you were inspired by all this, and if you want to know more about Jewish history or world history in general, I advise you to read my book In Search of the Sublime. You can read it for free on worldhistorybook.com, or you can buy a physical copy on Amazon. See you next time. Bye bye.